During the reign of Augustus, who presided over the Roman state as it transitioned from republic to empire, the poet Virgil wrote a superb allegorical poem about the legendary founding of Rome by a Trojan War refugee, Aeneas. This is how he begins. Of arms and the man I sing, who forced by fate and haughty Juno's unrelenting hate, expelled and exiled, left the Trojan shore. Long labours both by sea and land he bore, before he won the Latin realm and built the destined town. His banished gods restored to rights divine and settled sure succession in his line, from whence the race of Alban fathers come and the long glories of majestic Rome. Aeneas explicitly links Rome to the Trojan War and thus to the epic myths of the Greeks, a connection that remains strong throughout the long history of Rome, the civilization that came to supersede the Greeks as masters of the Mediterranean world. While the Greeks were establishing their polis in the Aegean and their colonies around the Mediterranean and Black Seas, a group of elites in a small city in central Italy revolted against their king and established a new form of government based on the rule of an aristocratic assembly they called the Senate. At this moment, late in the 6th century BCE, Rome was considerably less distinguished than a score of other cities scattered about the Italian peninsula. The ancestors of the Romans had established their settlement around a group of 7 hills on the banks of the Tiber River in the central Italian plains of Latium. The Italian peninsula is about 600 miles long, 4 times the size of Greece. And while it does have a mountainous spine, Italy is nowhere near as rugged as Greece, so roads could be more easily constructed across the mountains. The settlers had chosen their site well. The 7 hills were easy to defend, the village was built beside a ford across the Tiber River, and the central location of Latium made it easy for the Romans to eventually divide and conquer the entire peninsula. The long Booted Peninsula played an additional critical geographic role in the story of Rome. Because it juts far out into the heart of the Mediterranean Sea, it effectively divides the basin in half, which would help the Romans eventually take control of the whole of it. To the south of Rome were well-established Greek colonies that flourished along the coast of the mainland and the island of Sicily. To the north were the Etruscans, migrants from Asia Minor who were flourishing in the region called Tuscany today. According to some of the early foundation myths of the Romans, Etruscan kings gained control and ruled Rome for a while, but they were overthrown in a series of events that revolved around female virtue and male honor. In one myth, the son of King Tarquin, the Etruscan king who ruled Rome, raped the virtuous Roman wife Lucretia in her own home. When her father and husband returned, she demanded that they seek vengeance before committing suicide in front of them. Her father, husband, and other Roman nobles swore on the bloody suicide knife to avenge Lucretia's death by throwing out the Etruscan kings, which they did. Of course, we have no way of knowing if any of this story is true, but it became foundational to Roman history and dated the expulsion of the last Etruscan king to the year 509 BCE, which marked the end of Rome's monarchical period and the dawn of the Republic. Whether or not Rome was ever actually ruled by Etruscan kings, it went through significant changes during its monarchical period. Rome became a real city with walls and temples, paved roads, and a drainage system, and the Romans adopted the Etruscan alphabet, which the Etruscans themselves had adopted from the Greeks. The power of Rome's early kings was called the Imperium, power that was symbolized by an axe bound up in a bundle of rods called the fasces. This was the term 20th century Italian dictator Mussolini would later adopt to legitimize his totalitarian political ideology of fascism. To replace the monarchy, the Romans established a new form of government that placed executive power in the hands of 2 officials, the consuls, who were elected annually by the nobility. But the decisions of the consuls had to be ratified by the Senate, which thus constituted the real source of power in Rome. The Romans called this new form of government the res publica, which essentially means the commonwealth. This republican government would last, despite increasing strains, as we shall see, for almost half a millennium. Senators and consuls were members of the aristocratic patrician class, derived from the word for father, pater. Privileged status was determined by birth into elite families, much like the elite lineages that gave certain members of earlier human communities automatic status. Patrician men dominated the affairs of state, provided military leadership, and monopolized knowledge of law and legal procedure. The common people of Rome, the plebeians, were free citizens with some voice in politics, but few of the patricians' political and social advantages. Some plebeian merchants did eventually come to rival the patricians in wealth, but most plebeians were craft workers, peasant farmers, or landless urban poor. As was the case in Greece, this social inequality led to conflict. The plebeians sought to increase their political power by taking advantage of the fact that Rome's very survival depended on its army, whose ranks were filled by the plebeians. According to tradition, in 494 BCE, the plebeians staged a general strike and refused to serve in the army, forcing the patricians to make important concessions. The plebeians were now given the right to elect their own officials, known as tribunes, who were able to veto, a word that literally means I forbid, unfair consul decisions. Plebeians were also made eligible for other important offices, such as praetor, the chief legal officer, quaestor, the treasurer, and censor, responsible for public morality and state contracts. In 450 BCE, many of these provisions were enshrined in Roman law, which was written down on 12 tablets that were set up in the forum, the common meeting place of the heart of the city. By these various compromises, the power base was expanded, although the patricians still managed to maintain their privileged position through their ownership of agricultural land and their ability to buy the votes of elected plebeian officials. As we shall see, these privileges culminated in a renewed class struggle in the 2nd century BCE, which set in play a chain of events that led ultimately to the collapse of the Republic. Even as these political changes were occurring, the core social structure of the Roman state remained unchanged. We have quite a detailed understanding of gender roles in Roman society. The male head of the household was called the pater familias, and he had tremendous power over his wife and children, including in the early centuries, the power over life and death. Even after this was later modified, fathers retained the power to decide how family resources should be spent. Most Romans did marry patrician women in their mid-teens through contracts negotiated by their families, and plebeian women in their late teens. Slaves could also marry through the rule of contubernium, a benefit to their owner who also owned any children produced from it. The primary interest of elite Roman males was not in their families, but in the affairs of state, and this occupied much of their time. The 1st century CE historian Plutarch captured this idealized attitude of the patrician male when he wrote, "It is a noble thing and the mark of an exalted Roman man's spirit to exclaim, 'I love my children, but I love my country more.'" Patrician women could own property, although the job of a patrician wife was to supervise domestic arrangements while her husband conducted his business and political affairs in public. Plebeian women in Rome had pressures of a different kind to deal with because in an age of high infant mortality, they needed to give birth to an average of 5 or 6 children just to maintain a stable population. Even if the marriage was stable, plebeian women were trapped in this cycle of childbirth and rearing from which death was the only escape, as this funerary inscription found in a Roman province demonstrates. "Here I lie, a woman named Veturia. I lived for 27 years and I was married for 16 years to the same man. After I gave birth to 6 children, only one of whom is still alive, I died." Veturia's fate is emblematic of the condition of women everywhere during the era of agrarian civilizations. Because a woman's primary role was the birthing and rearing of children and the provision of a steady stream of new workers, soldiers, and citizens, women of necessity were confined to the home for most of their lives. The need for women to start producing early also explains why girls were married in their teens. Marital problems were common in the crowded city, but never marrying or widowhood were worse, and many Roman women were forced into prostitution by necessity. Beyond the domestic sphere, the Roman Republic regularly found itself in conflict with its neighbours. It conducted its foreign affairs so effectively, however, that it eventually came to dominate the entire Italian peninsula. Now, historians differ on the question of whether Rome ever intended to create a large tributary empire, or whether Roman expansion was rather a result of sensible responses to security threats. Rome was humiliated in 309 BCE by a party of marauding Gauls who occupied the city and only agreed to leave after they were paid off with a sizable ransom. Determined to ensure this would not happen again, the Romans rebuilt their military into a formidable force based on maneuverable infantry units of 120 men called maniples, armed with javelins and short swords. As Etruscan power waned in the north, the Greek colonies in the south became increasingly concerned about Rome and called in the mercenary king Pyrrhus of Epirus to come and fight the Romans on their behalf. Pyrrhus brought his war elephants and soldiers to southern Italy and defeated the Romans twice, but at such cost to his own forces that a costly triumph has since been called a Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhus was forced to withdraw, but by 270 Rome had conquered all the city-states of southern Italy. The Romans did not impose harsh sanctions on defeated peoples, however, allowing conquered states to remain self-governing so long as they provided levies of troops and supported Roman foreign policy. This enlightened form of hegemony paid enormous dividends when the Republic faced its sternest challenge in a life and death struggle with Carthage. By 270 BCE, Rome's one remaining rival in the Mediterranean was Carthage, a city established centuries earlier as a Phoenician trading colony on the coast of North Africa. Carthage was now a wealthy state and possessed a superior navy to the Romans, but the Mediterranean was just too small to accommodate two such expansive powers. In a series of three conflicts known as the Punic Wars, Rome and Carthage battled for survival and control of the Mediterranean basin. The Latin word punicus, by the way, refers to Carthage's origin as a Phoenician colony. The First Punic War broke out in 264 when Carthage landed a force in Sicily. In a series of naval battles that followed, Rome lost 500 ships but forced Carthage to sue for peace. Rome immediately annexed the Carthaginian territories of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, the beginning of its overseas empire, and installed senatorial governors to rule them. Determined to avenge this humiliation, a young Carthaginian general named Hannibal set out on a military campaign against the Romans that was every bit as audacious as that of Alexander a century earlier. Hannibal arrived in the Carthaginian province in Spain in 225 BCE, aged 18. A year later, he was appointed as commander-in-chief of the Carthaginian forces there. In the spring of 221, he provoked the Romans into declaring war against him by besieging the neutral city of Saguntum, then boldly marched north up the coast of Spain and into Roman territory with a full army and a detachment of elephants for use in battle. But the Romans had no idea where Hannibal had gone. A group of Roman soldiers was astonished when they stumbled across the Carthaginians near the mouth of the Rhone River in southern Gaul. Before they could assemble a military response, Hannibal disappeared again, floating his army and elephants across the Rhone River before heading east into the Alps. The Romans had no expectation that Hannibal would attempt something as ambitious as crossing the Alps with his army and elephants, especially with winter coming on. But that is exactly what Hannibal did, crossing a 10,000-foot high pass in November 218 before descending into northern Italy and capturing the settlement of the Taurini tribe, the modern city of Turin. News of his arrival in Italy sent shockwaves through Rome, which hastily assembled an army and sent it north to head off the Carthaginians. Near the junction of the Po and Ticino rivers, Hannibal defeated the Roman cavalry by superior strategy, and then a week later defeated a larger Roman force on the banks of the Trebia River. In the spring of 217, Hannibal headed south, capturing a Roman colony near modern Florence before destroying a large Roman army on the shores of Lake Trasimene. 15,000 Roman soldiers were ambushed and killed by the Carthaginians, who came charging down the mist-covered slopes and drove the Romans into the lake, where they were cut down or drowned. As Hannibal continued south, the Romans assembled yet another army, which rushed to confront him on flat ground near the village of Cannae. By using a superb enveloping strategy, Hannibal trapped and utterly defeated two consular armies at the Battle of Cannae, leaving 50,000 dead Roman soldiers on the blood-soaked plain. After Cannae, Hannibal was supreme in Italy and had nothing to fear from any legions. His generals urged him to march on Rome itself, but Hannibal bided his time, preferring to remain in the south to try and convince the Italian city-states to abandon their loyalty to Rome and come over to the Carthaginian side. The Romans had learned their lessons and did not dare to confront Hannibal in open battle again, adopting instead a cautious rearguard policy and reassuring their allies that they were better off remaining loyal to Rome. By 211, the strategy seemed to be working. Roman forces were strong enough to begin besieging those few cities that had gone over to Hannibal. In an attempt to lift the sieges, Hannibal finally marched on Rome itself, camping on the banks of the River Arno, 6 miles from the city centre and in full view of the terrified residents. He rode right up to the very walls of the city, but heavy rain forestalled the battle and Hannibal eventually withdrew. This was as close to Rome as Hannibal would ever come. Most of Rome's Italian allies remained loyal, and Hannibal was constantly frustrated in being unable to inflict a mortal blow. Eventually, after 16 years of Carthaginian occupation, the Romans under General Scipio Africanus launched an attack on the city of Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to return to North Africa to defend his homeland. At the Battle of Zama in 201, Scipio defeated Hannibal and Carthaginian power was crushed. As the historian Adrian Goldsworthy has pointed out, the Punic Wars were fought on a scale scarcely rivaled before the modern age. Hundreds of thousands of military personnel were deployed in theatres spanning the entire Mediterranean basin, including the Balkans, Greece, Sicily, North Africa, Spain, France, the Alps, and the Italian peninsula. The cost of maintaining these large armies and navies consumed the economic resources of both states, and the human costs were even higher, with massive loss of life suffered at several major battles. And as has been the case with all modern wars, casualties were not confined to the military. Huge numbers of civilians were also killed, massacred following the siege of a city, killed in raids on villages and farms by the armies of both sides, or starving because of the confiscation of crops and animals to provision the troops. By the end of the protracted conflict, Carthage was in ruins and its culture extinguished, despite Hannibal's extraordinary efforts. Had Rome not been able to withstand Hannibal's invasion, her imperial ambitions, even her survival as a state, would have been severely undermined, and the entire course of world history dramatically altered. Rome not only survived, but evolved from a regional Italian power to a position of unrivaled dominance in the Mediterranean world. By 146 CE, the year in which Carthage was finally destroyed, Rome was well on its way to creating a vast empire that would gain control over much of Western Eurasia and North Africa. The struggle with Carthage thus enabled the Romans to conceive of themselves for the first time as a world power and accustom them to sending armies over large distances to fight in several international theatres simultaneously. This was something that the Romans would continue to do successfully for the next 500 years. With the defeat of Carthage, the Romans turned to other foreign policy matters. King Philip V of Macedon, a descendant of Alexander, had allied himself with Hannibal. So in 197 BCE, Roman legions conquered Macedonia in revenge, liberating the Greek polis from Macedonian control at the same time. The ruler of the Seleucid Empire used this opportunity to try and become more involved in Greek affairs, but the Romans forced the Seleucids to retreat, and when they tried to invade Egypt, they were crushed by the Romans in 168. Despite being greeted as liberators by the Greeks, the Romans faced an uprising in Corinth, and in 146 they put it down and annexed all of Greece in the aftermath. A brief Carthaginian revival was crushed by Rome that same year, and the city was destroyed. After the king of Pergamon bequeathed his kingdom to Rome in 133 BCE, the Romans possessed provinces in 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, declaring the Mediterranean to be Mare Nostrum, or our see, the Romans began to create administrative machinery to hold their growing state together through a provincial system ruled by governors, just as empire builders in Mesopotamia, Persia, and China had done before them. With the conquest of the Mediterranean world, Rome became a great city, spending the massive amount of war booty it had accumulated to build theatres, stadiums, and other magnificent structures. Romans began to spend more of their time in leisure pursuits, influenced by Hellenistic culture. They became avid consumers of Greek literature and philosophy, and educated Romans learned to speak both Latin and Greek. The Roman conquest of the Greek world also led to whole-scale confiscation of Greek works of art, which now graced Roman temples, public buildings, and private homes. But even as cultured Romans learned to enjoy their leisure, the Roman state was careening into a series of economic, social, and political crises that could all be traced back to the effects of Hannibal's occupation of the Italian peninsula. Many small farms had been destroyed by military operations, and many farmers had been recruited as soldiers by the Romans. After the wars, these veterans joined the ranks of the unemployed in Rome, where they became known as the proletariat, so called because they had few possessions and their only measurable contribution was proles, the Latin word for children. Wealthy senators bought up the abandoned farmland and used it to grow cash crops like olive oil and wine instead of grain, working their estates with prisoners of war as slave labor, further exacerbating the unemployment problem for free farm laborers. These senators were also appointed as governors of the new Roman provinces, where they took advantage of easy, corrupt profits and made sure their elite colleagues received lucrative government contracts to supply armies and materials. Despite the class wars of centuries earlier, Roman government remained a senatorial oligarchy focused solely on protecting the rights of the rich and powerful. With no solutions to the problem of an impoverished lower class and an efficient and an inefficient system for governing a world state based on the corrupt rule of senatorial governors, Rome seethed with discontent. It was the failure of the Senate to address these problems that led ultimately to the collapse of the Republic and the emergence of the Roman Empire. Some patricians did attempt to relieve the situation, like the tribune Tiberius Gracchus, who, in an attempt to limit the size of senatorial farms, tried to introduce a law that would limit the amount of public land individuals could hold. The Senate persuaded the tribunes to veto this measure, so Tiberius had the popular assembly depose the tribunes and still pass the law. The Senate accused him of acting like a king and had Tiberius and 300 of his followers murdered. Tiberius's younger brother Gaius was elected tribune in 123 and proposed establishing colonies for military veterans in Italy and Africa. To protect the urban poor against price gouging in the grain market, he also legislated for the government to subsidize grain distribution at half the market price. This became known as the dole and was later used by unscrupulous politicians to buy votes. Gaius ran for re-election in 121, but he and 3,000 of his followers died during violent rioting, with nothing having been achieved to redress the social problems. Then, between 111 and 105 BCE, Roman legions were defeated in Africa and Germany, and in the crisis that followed, the People's Assembly elected a tough soldier named Gaius Marius as consul in 107. Marius put down the foreign uprisings and professionalized the Roman army, recruiting it from landless peasants who now owed their loyalty to their commander rather than to the Senate. This marked the beginning of the personal armies that powerful men could use to threaten the government. In 88 BCE, the Senate sent their general Sulla to put down an uprising in Asia Minor, but the people chose Marius to go and fight the same war, leading to the First Civil War. The war was won by Sulla, who proved himself to be even tougher than Marius. The Senate appointed him sole dictator, which gave the senatorial elites complete control of legislation until Sulla retired in 79. More ambitious men now appeared on the political scene, determined to gain personal power. Men like Pompey Magnus, who was elected consul in 70 BCE, and Julius Caesar, who was elected consul in 59, and then immediately left Rome and spent the next 9 years campaigning in Gaul, building a personal fortune and a well-trained personal army. Upon Caesar's return from Gaul, Pompey and the Senate demanded that he disband his army before crossing the Rubicon River, which marked the boundary between Gaul and the territory controlled by Rome and its allies. But Caesar refused and marched on Rome, causing Pompey and most of the Senate to flee to Greece. Caesar pursued them and defeated them, and this second civil war was over by 45 BCE. Victorious, Caesar assumed the title of dictator for the administration of public affairs and moved vigorously to reduce the social tensions in Rome. He passed laws to reduce debt, established colonies outside of Italy, and declared that 1/3 of all labourers on estates had to be free. These measures helped reduce the numbers of people receiving government-subsidised grain from 320,000 to 150,000 out of a total population of around 500,000. This startling statistic gives us a very clear picture of the staggering social inequality in Rome during the late Republic. Before the enactment of Caesar's laws, some 64% of the population of the city was poor enough to require government handouts just to survive. Caesar now argued that the Republic was dead, which led some patricians to view him as a tyrant. He was assassinated on March the 15th, 44 BCE, by Brutus and others claiming they were attempting to restore Roman liberty. In the aftermath, it was Caesar's 18-year-old adopted son, Octavian, who stepped forward, formed an alliance with Mark Antony and the Senate, and pursued and defeated the conspirators. But the allies fell out when Antony was put in charge of the eastern reaches of the state and promptly fell in love with Cleopatra. Cleopatra was destined to be the last of the line of rulers established by Alexander's former general and boyhood friend, Ptolemy. Octavian, declaring that Rome had been polluted by this alliance, defeated Antony's armies. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide, and the Roman state was unified under Octavian, who was hailed as father of the country by the Senate. This is the moment that the Republic gave way to the permanent dictatorship of the empire, not yet in name, but certainly in fact. Octavian shrewdly governed as a dictator while appearing to rule in conjunction with the Senate, which renamed him Augustus, or the Revered One. Augustus's total control of the army also meant he was hailed by a different title, Imperator, or Victorious General, a title that would evolve into Emperor under his successors. After a century of civil war, Augustus now concentrated on restoring the integrity of the state and traditional Roman values. By reducing corruption, professionalizing the army, and founding more than 40 colonies for its veterans, his reforms led to a new age of peace and optimism that was celebrated in the brilliant literature of Virgil, who in the Aeneid speaks of Augustus thus: "This is the man of whom so often you have heard the promise, Caesar Augustus, son of the deified, who shall bring once again an age of gold to Latium, to the land where Saturn reigned in early times." It was also in the days of Caesar Augustus, according to the Bible's book of Luke, that a child named Jesus was born, an event that would ultimately lead to a wholesale transformation in Western civilization.